and welcome to episode 37 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is John Dinning, back in Los Angeles.
Back in Los Angeles after many travels here this month.
Something like a whirlwind week. Yeah, I was all over the East Coast.
Stopped in Charleston, I know.
I did. Saw the family for an early Christmas. It was the only time my sister could do it. That was Augusta. And then, 6 days in Charleston. Feels like 6 months. But it was fun.
Charleston's your town, man. You used to own that place, so...
I felt like the prodigal son. Caught up with a lot of old friends, made a couple new ones. It was a good time.
Sounds like a good time. I miss Charleston. One of my favorite places.
There's an awful lot to miss.
I have not been there in a while, but I will be back relatively soon, so watch out.
Well, Charleston misses you, buddy. That I can comfortably say.
Now, I also know you've been a little bit sick, so what are you drinking today?
Well, what I probably should be drinking is something like Dayquil or Pedialyte, but what I'm actually drinking is just coffee.
Straight coffee?
Yeah, believe it or not. Straight
sugar,
coffee.
creamer?
I'm gonna take a day off. Although I've got a holiday party I have to go to tonight. It's the last night, apparently, of Hanukkah, so my Jewish friends are all getting together.
Cool.
That should be a good time.
Yeah, that'll be a good party.
Yeah.
Well, I am also drinking coffee. That's because we're recording a little bit earlier than normal.
Fair.
So I've got the old Starbucks Double Shot Energy mocha flavor.
I don't know about that. I don't like mocha.
What do you mean you don't know about it? I
like
actually prefer hazelnut, but I'll take, and then vanilla, and mocha's third, but I'll take it.
Take it. Well, anyway.
It's just got a lot of sugar in it. That's my big objection. It's like 35 grams of sugar. It's like drinking a Coke.
Oof. As long as you and I can just both stay awake through this thing, that's all that really matters.
I'm actually really excited about this. We're going to talk about the November 2019 LSAT Logic Games section, and then I think we're going to stop talking about the November LSAT for a long time because we've had multiple episodes on it due to all the problems and the makeups and all that jazz. I think, it's always great to talk about Logic Games. I would love to talk about the LR as well and eventually the RC, but I don't think we're going to get to that anytime soon. I want to move on to some actual other topics.
We touched on these games already, I think episode 35, so a couple weeks back. But that was before we had a copy of the test, which is the beauty.
That's exactly right.
The beauty of these disclosed tests is we can actually see them.
Yes, and I've looked at this closely. I know you have as well.
Sure.
And as we'll talk about it in a minute, this is an interesting section in certain respects and less interesting in others.
Yeah. I got a bunch of very confused looks on an airplane as I was furiously diagramming.
What's he drawing over there? Yeah. Well, the last piece of information of note, the music for today.
Sure.
And we've made kind of like, I think, an inspired holiday selection since we've slowed down a little bit on the podcast recording this month. The song we've chosen is Electric Relaxation, and it is by a tribe called Quest.
I love that
Very
band.
Cool tune, cool band.
Great band.
And I don't know. I think from a holiday perspective, we felt like let's just chill this out, have a good time, and so we went with a tune that I feel like matches that really well.
I agree.
So let's move on to the LSAT world, see what's going on there.
What is going on? I have not kept as close a tab on this as you have, I know.
It's right now, LSAC is closed for their traditional week-long winter break, so they're not doing a whole lot. The biggest deal was obviously LSAT scores were released on the 19th. Right now, there are still people who don't have LSAT scores, and that is due to the fact that they lodged complaints about the testing conditions, and when that happens, they put a hold on your file. And of course, now that LSAC is closed, they're not getting their scores. And I feel really bad for those people because it's like, that's unfair to hold your scores over a complaint this long. This should be resolved more quickly.
It's pretty brutal. You think about it, they're the ones who are already victims. And then they get doubled down on.
That's an excellent point. It's kind of like you are penalized for the problems that were beyond your control.
For suffering a penalty.
So let's penalize you again.
Right.
Thanks so much.
Exactly. So it goes. You will have your scores soon enough. The good news, I suppose, if we were going to put a shiny side to this, schools are still all going to accept scores at this point. No schools.
Oh, yeah.
You haven't missed any deadlines. You won't miss any deadlines. It's all going to work out. But it's aggravating to sit in limbo in this purgatory.
And also, if your complaint is substantiated, they'll usually put a note in your file that says there were problems with the testing conditions. That kind of thing can only help you.
Yeah.
I don't think it helps a lot, but it's better than nothing. The other things that have happened in the last couple of weeks is they've come out with a couple, blogs and podcasts, mostly about data or kind of like a certain degree of self-promotion about, look what we've done, which I'm fine with that. I mean, every company does that. The blog, I think, is probably the most interesting. It's called Sizing Up the 2019 Incoming Class. What do the numbers tell us? And it's got interesting facts about applicants and law school sizes. Go ahead and give it a read. Just don't read the second half because it devolves into, look what we did. And the podcast, they're back into the 5-minute range. So apparently the criticism that we gave about 2 minutes is not a podcast. That's something I accidentally recorded at 2 a.m. They've gone up to 5 minutes, but it's the same information largely as what we see on the blog. So use it as your own. Use it as you wish.
Yeah.
Probably the biggest piece of information is that the January 2020 test shows about 24,000 applicants, which is a solid
That's a big
group of students. Yeah, that's reasonably large. So the other thing about that November test, which I think is worth us mentioning, is the scaling on that.
Yeah, we do need to talk about this.
And it plays right into what we're about to talk about, which is these games. The scale came in at -10 for a 170, so you can miss 10 questions. And I think it's very interesting. We had predicted -11, and I got a lot of criticism for that. I was told repeatedly, especially in private, that I was an idiot. I always appreciate that too, because I'm like, okay.
I assume you're paraphrasing a bit, but maybe not.
What am I supposed to do? Sorry that you disagree with me. That it was absolutely no possible way that it was -11, that this test was incredibly difficult, and it was either -12 or more likely -13.
I heard a lot of 13s coming through. And first, can I just back up? I'm the only one, maybe your wife, with the privilege of calling you an idiot.
Anybody can call me an idiot.
I'm actually offended.
I don't have a problem. I'm not one of those people who gets upset when someone insults me. I'm like, okay, we disagree. So I always take that with a big grain of salt. I'm usually like, if I'm possibly wrong, I'll be like, well, I might be wrong, dude. I don't know.
That's the trouble with these predictions, is there's always a reasonable chance we're wrong. We're usually never wrong by more than one. And that's what happened here.
Well, I had one person who really was going at me saying that there was no chance that it was -11 and that this test was a -14 and they were willing to put money on it. And I was like, okay, how much money do you want to put on it? And because -14 by itself is very rare.
Yeah.
And there was little to suggest the scale was that extreme. But I did not really think that it was going to be -10. There were so many people thinking it was -12 or -13. I'm like, if I'm wrong here, it's that I've been too conservative. Now that I've looked at this test, I understand the -10. And it goes to show you how differences in exams can really be magnified. Like, for example, the logic games in the September test are, in my opinion, demonstrably harder than they are in this section. However, the last game on this section, as we will talk about, I think is very challenging. And that almost cast a shadow back over the entire section. Because people had difficulty at the end, they thought, well, that whole section was tough, and that makes them think the scale is going to be looser. So I understand that. This is one of the most difficult things about predicting scales, is that very minor differences in difficulty can be magnified in people's minds. And that affects the perception that we ultimately have, even though we talk to a whole, wide variety of people and we have information on these tests from their usages in the past.
Yeah, we hear from hundreds of people, but we don't take these tests ourselves, which immediately, in a way, handicaps us because we have to go on secondhand information.
Not to be too complimentary or self-complimentary, the fact that we're as accurate as we are is actually really a testament to how good we are at this. That's right. I'm willing to actually say that. Sometimes I'm like, well, I'm upset about being wrong, but at the same time, I'm like, still close, even when you miss it. This was one where I really wanted to get it right, and so to be off by one was frustrating. But
to me, when we talk about these scales, it's less about the nature of that is the exact number, we nailed it, and more about the nature of like, do we think the overall difficulty is what it is? Do you think this could be closer to a 13 or 14 or more like a 10 or 11? And that it's more of a shading to me than a black and white.
You know, I took statistics when I was in college, and it reminds me of the idea of confidence intervals, where what's our confidence in this? Is it 100%? No. It's very hard to do that. I would never say this is exactly what the scale is going to be. I feel like I have a high level of confidence, but not a perfect, like a 90% or 95% kind of range that's in there. And that interval usually would allow for a plus or minus one scenario, and that's so frequently what occurs. So it's not a science. It's part science, it's part magic, it's part guesstimation.
Yeah. I will say we missed it. And if this in any way, if someone's listening to this right now and thinking like, look at those guys trying to cover their own, error. It's not that. This doesn't feel like an apology so much as just a discussion of what's the nature of what we're really trying to accomplish. Is the scale going to be tight? This was. Is the scale going to be loose? September was. That's more of what I think you and I are trying to establish when we make these predictions. And partly it's just fun. I just like to see if I can guess it.
I like doing that, yeah. And I feel like we're pretty close, which is already a testament to general ability on this. Yeah, I'm in a self-complimentary mood apparently in the holidays.
Somebody's feeling good today.
I'm happy, yay. It's just more, it is a very challenging thing to do, and to do it on the consistent, level is almost, it's impossible to get it right every time.
Of course.
Nobody's done it, nobody's approached that, nobody ever will. So you'd have to have inside information to get it right every time. And we've got some insider information, but we don't have that kind of insider information.
Right. So let's talk about what made the scale so tight, which tends to be largely predicated on the games themselves. You ready?
I am ready.
All right.
Let's start off with the disclaimer as we talk about.
I was going to do it, but you're welcome to.
First off, if you have not done this section, there's two ways to go about it. Number one, postpone listening to this. Number two, we actually have this entire section and this entire test up on our digital platform. So you can go take it right now if you want to, whether in part or in whole. But if you haven't done it yet, we're going to give away some of the key pieces to each one of these games. So maybe push it back a little bit before you do this.
Yeah, your performance here would be a bit prejudicial listening to this before doing it. So if you're looking for the most accurate litmus, as it were, go download this from our site now, and we'll put a link in this so you can do it.
That's exactly right. So let's get into it.
Cool.
Overall difficulty of the section, not among the hardest ever.
This felt right down the middle, basically, center lane.
Yeah, and if I'm going to kind of like describe this on an overall basis, I would say this. I do think that last game is difficult. I think the first three games give you time to build to that last game. Whereas in the September test, there was, each game had a fairly high level of difficulty. Yeah. You didn't really get any breathing space. Here you get breathing space. I don't think any of the first three games is hard. I do think there are tricks and traps inside these games that can cause problems. And if you make one of those mistakes, the section gets way harder. So if you're sitting there and you didn't do well on this section, and you're like, these guys are saying the section isn't hard. Look, there's a big caveat there. What we're saying is if you fell into one of their traps, yeah, the section difficulty goes way up. It could go from like a 4 all the way to a 9 just because of one error. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we get into this. Also, I think there are better ways to do these games versus, less efficient ways to do it. And if you don't go down the right pathway or close to the most efficient pathway, it gets harder.
Yeah, that's, I think, a very fair description. All I could think in going through these games is, man, these are all right in the wheelhouse of someone who's well prepared. As opposed to September, where it was like, as well studied as you may be, each of those games was still going to fight back.
Yeah, you had to work.
Yeah.
September was
just a grind, man. It was a buzzsaw.
It was that Britney Spears song, you got to work.
Bitch.
That's exactly right. This one feels a little bit more like Electric Relaxation to me until the end, in which case the difficulty spirals way up. So let's start off with the first game.
Sure.
John, you want to cover it or you want me to open it?
Well, what I thought was interesting about this game from the outset is it appears unbalanced because you've got essentially 5 pieces to assign to 7 spots. And I want to be careful about how much information, even about the games, we quote, just for the sake of keeping things legal.
But yeah, we should be pretty good.
Yeah, I think we'll be fine. But you could balance this game out by just adding 2 additional pieces. I used E's. I'm sure some people use maybe X's or something. But 5 into 7, there were 2 empty spots. Choose a variable, assign a variable for those empty spots, and then you've got 7 things to place. It balances it out. So that was the first thing I noticed and did here myself.
Yeah. Well, this is the agent training game.
Yes.
And you've got these agents getting trained over a 7-month period. So 7 months in a row like that immediately strikes me as basic linear game.
Sure.
And then, as you point out, there's 7 months, but there's only 5 agents. You need to handle that because it looks like it's underfunded to begin with. I chose X's.
Okay. I used E's.
So for me, I just had Q, R, S, T, U, and then 2 X's. 2 E's would work fine. I don't care what you do. You can put an asterisk there as long as you understand what it is you're looking at. That turns the game into a balanced game. And at that point, it's just a 7 into 7, and that empty space is doubled. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the first rule then throws it right into one of them, right into month number 6.
Yeah, it's empty.
I'm like, now it's a 6 into 6 game, although you have this little wall at the, towards the very end of the game.
Let me make a quick comment to that point, because I think it's often overlooked how that's going to function or how it's going to impact other things. To me, anytime I see a place in a linear game like that is locked down, that's fixed, I start to think about blocks, how blocks are going to move and the not laws that are going to naturally be created, or even the positions that become impossible. Like imagine there was a block of 2. You can't put it down towards the end. You've got to shift it up closer to the front of the game. That, to me, is where a position filled really becomes impactful.
That's huge. Mm-hmm. And sequences aren't affected quite as much, but blocks are hugely affected. And whenever you have a block that's like in the second position or the second to last position, and you're leaving the first or last space kind of isolated, you know that there's going to be placement issues. Yep. And that turns out to be a really big deal in this game because you get a QT block later on.
There it is, the third rule. Exactly.
Yeah. And all of a sudden, Q and T can't go at the very end. Q's restricted from being in space number 5. It now pushes that QT earlier in the game, and it's tough to know where it will actually play out. And the last 2 questions get into this kind of abstract positioning of what can happen, and they play around with like the spacing of the variables in a way I think that caught people off guard.
Yeah.
So I totally am with you on that.
Perfect.
When I see that little wall down there with that X on spot 6 or E, I'm like, I got to watch out for this.
Yeah, a wall's a good way to put it because it becomes a literal physical barrier to movement of certain things. It's very important. You made a comment earlier that I think we can circle back to, which is there were opportunities to screw up. And to me, the greatest one in this game is the last rule.
Agreed 100%. When I read this rule, when I was doing this game, I immediately was like, this worries me. Because I can see where people would make errors with this. When you look at that rule, which says S is the third agent to be trained, under the pressure of the test, it's really easy to think, fantastic, S is third, and to put S into the third position. The problem with that is that we have empty spaces, and it doesn't say S is trained in the 3rd month. It says S is the third agent, which means that if months 1 and 2 are filled with actual agents, then S will be in the 3rd month.
Not necessarily. S could still be 4th.
I'm not done.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, you cut me off halfway through there.
Okay.
If one of the first 3 months is empty, then S can be trained in the 4th month.
Gotcha.
Because what I said was that if one of the first 2 months has an agent, then S would be 3rd.
Yeah, it appears. Where that other empty month is going to potentially affect S in 3 or 4. But I'm sure. In fact, I read this rule twice to make sure I didn't screw it up.
Me too.
I'm sure there were a lot of people out there that just, again, in the panic, the pressure of test day, S in 3, and they moved through the game. Now, there are chances to correct yourself here. which I also want to point out. Mistakes in games don't have to be permanent. You can usually figure out that you've done something wrong. But I know in this case, a lot of people probably never quite caught it.
It can be really tough. And just to summarize, if S is in the third month, the first 2 months have agents in them. If S is in the fourth month, it means the empty space is ahead of S, somewhere in the first 3 months.
Perfect.
Although limited.
Yeah, that's, I think, a perfect summation. And the very first question allows you to catch this because, again, you can start to see S is in the fourth month in a number of the answer choices. That to me would be a huge clue that I had made a mistake if I had it in 3 permanently.
Yeah, in fact, 3 of the answer choices have S in the fourth month. Mm-hmm. One of them has S in the fifth month. And the other answer choice, which is D, has S in the third month. And it would be really easy for someone to be like, well, it's got to be D. Mm-hmm. But of course, you got to be really careful there because that answer doesn't have any other violations and they're setting people up to be like, D's the right answer, when in fact the correct answer is A in that problem.
Yeah.
So I don't find that it's all that difficult of a game as long as you interpret that last rule correctly. And then the first 3 questions are all really specific. I mean, you got a list question, a couple local questions about if this agent is trained here. I don't think any of the first 3 questions are overly challenging. But then questions 4 and 5 are actually, I think, much harder because they are global, much more abstract questions. Like, for example, it's really hard to know in question 4, wait, there's some kind of limitation on you. There's certain limitations, like that you can't be 7th. But this is interesting because when you have a question like number 4, and it says, which of the following could be the month in which you is trained? Well, what they're really saying is one of those months could be possible, and the other 4 can't. Which means you is a lot more restricted than I think people realized out of the gate here.
Yeah, there are at least 4 months where you can't go, and that's what that question tells you.
Yeah, and one of the months that they've missed, that they didn't put in here is 5.
Question 1.
Aggravatingly used in month 5, and also the hypothetical for question number 3 uses you in month 5. So it's like the easiest one, it's not there. And it's really limited. As it turns out, you can only go in 1, 4, and 5, and that's because of the interplay of both the block as well as the empty spaces.
And the thing about Shaw, yeah.
Yeah. And then you get to question number 5, which is also very abstract, and it's like, okay, one of the months that's in there, you cannot have an empty space. And as it turns out, it's 2, because if you put an empty space in 2, you'd have empty space in 2, Shaw in 4, empty space in 6, and it would be alternating. There'd be no room for the QT block. And so both 4 and 5 are tough questions, tough to figure out those inferences. I think actually unlikely for people to figure out those inferences while setting the game up. So you'll have to do a little bit of work at the end of this game to actually figure it out.
Yeah.
I already put an explanation for this game online. In fact, I've explained a bunch of the LR here already and some of the game stuff just because as I was going through it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I want to talk about that.
Yeah, if you want to self-congratulate today, that's really, I think, where most of the praise lives. I'm bouncing around Charleston like a maniac, and you're out there doing LR explanations.
Yeah, you're either traveling, sick, partying, and I'm sitting here working. Thanks, man. This has been a great holiday season.
Yeah, you've carried me through December. I appreciate it.
Actually, I've really enjoyed explaining, especially the LR in this test, and some of the logic games that I've gotten to as well. Sometimes it's just really fun to explain things, and I don't get to do it as much as I want to. Yeah. So I've actually enjoyed it. It's not a self-congratulatory thing at all. It's just
either way, you've been my Rudolph. I appreciate it.
Well, either way, that said, I appreciate helping you out. I think this is a decent start to this test. Mm-hmm. I'd prefer to have seen more than 5 questions, but you can see where people might have gotten thrown off with that last rule, those last 2 questions, maybe not so comfortable. If you're uncertain, try some hypotheticals. Questions like 4 and 5 are built around that. If you don't understand how the Shaw thing works and it was giving you some difficulty, start putting it in there and trying a few solutions and seeing what happens. So let's move on, because I think that covers one of maybe the least interesting of the games to talk about. Certainly not the most interesting.
No. What about game 2? This, what do we call it, soup recipe ingredients game?
Yeah, there's an old soup ingredients game from years ago, so we call this one soup recipe ingredients. Which, whatever.
You got to make the distinction.
Well, we've done so now.
Okay.
And I want to say that, especially when they're talking about making soup around Thanksgiving, that this is not a soup that I personally would like to eat. That was my first thought. I was like, there's kale in this soup, which I am strongly against kale. Not a big yam fan.
Yeah, there's jalapeno and yam. I'm not sure how those necessarily meld. That's pretty gross.
It wasn't my choice. At least they didn't put both yams and potatoes, which are really similar to each other in this. But,
well,
yeah.
I can tell you where my head was when I started this game. I thought this was going to be just pure grouping at first. 7 potential ingredients for this chef to pick. And I thought it was just going to be a 1 to 7 wide open. Birds in the forest or friends in a photo album. I thought it was going to be one of those types of games. And of course, it's not. What you find as you read a little further into it is that there's also
grouping.
It's grouping.
And then all of a sudden, it's linear.
Yeah, there's also an order to which the ingredients are put in here or added. And that, to me, gave it a little more structure in a way, but it also added an extra layer, I suppose, of complexity for a lot of people.
It's more work to do, more difficulty for sure. I thought this game looked like it could be really irritating at first, and then as I read through all the rules, I kind of was relieved. And there's kind of a thematic thing that happened at times in this section. Like in that first game, the first 3 questions are really specific and localized, and the last 2 are really abstract. It felt like a dichotomy of questions to me. The rules in this game did the same thing to me. There was a dichotomy of rule organization. Like the first 3 are these kind of very specific, if this variable does this, then this other variable does this. And then the last 2 are very different. It's like, all right, these are 4 ingredients that you have to have, and by the way, they're in a big sequence.
Yeah.
I loved those last 2 rules, and to me, that was the heart of this game. That made this game much easier if you were able to focus on those last 2 rules first, because you were able to put this sequence of onion ahead of garlic, and then garlic ahead of kale and tomato. And that gives you this base to work with.
Yeah.
So I was able to see that. And then I went back and I looked at the first 3 rules, and they actually, the interplay between those 3 rules is really solid. So what I did when I attacked this is I was like, well, it sure seems to me that if jalapeno is an ingredient or not is going to trigger 2 very different directions. If I know that jalapeno is an ingredient in this game, it's either at the beginning or the end of this long sequence. That onion garlic sequence. And then it's a matter of what happens with the potato. Mm-hmm. Because as soon as I've got jalapeno, we know that yam is out. And then we know we have to have yam and potato. Right. So it's like, well, where does the potato go? So if you have jalapeno, yam's gone, potato is somewhere in there, we just don't know where it is. That's your big uncertainty. That's one template to me. The other template is you get the jalapeno out of there, and then you know that you can have either the potato or the yam. You just don't know which one it is, and it can go really anywhere at that point. And that's the other template. And to me, I made this game into 2 templates, and I was like, I love this. And so you got to focus on those last 2 rules as establishing the base, and then focus on the way the jalapeno interplays with the yam and the potato to make 2 templates. Game's easy.
Yeah, and to preach a slightly broader lesson here, this was one of those games where I was so glad I read all the way through before I started to diagram.
True.
Because I read those last 2 rules, same as you did, and immediately that was the linchpin moment for me. I was like, okay, here's where this goes from very hypothetical, if jalapeno, to this is locked down a lot more, I think, than most people would realize.
Well, this is something that you and I are both big fans of, and we preach a lot. Just read the game first, man.
Yeah.
Take your time, go through it. It allows you to see things like in that first game about Shaw being trained third, or the third agent trained. It allows you to see these last 2 rules and realize maybe I should start there as the base. That'll make me feel a lot more comfortable at the rest of it.
Right.
So at that point, I felt like this game really was something that I could control. Then I started pressuring the game as opposed to it pressuring me.
Yeah, completely the same. This was also the game on the test that had the rule substitution question, which I'm sure we will come to.
Yeah. And I think they did that because if you have the right approach to this game, the game does not feel challenging. Mm-mm. but it's easy not to have the right approach. And so you have to go back and look at what's really happening with the variables. 4 of the 7 variables are basically in the game and taken care of. That means for me, at least as a test taker who's trying to analyze a game up front, I'm going to analyze the other 3 variables.
Sure.
And that's when we see how powerful jalapeno is. I mean, it would be pretty powerful in a soup anyway.
Funny way to say it.
If mom decides to add a jalapeno to the soup, it's going to be a spicy Thanksgiving, you know?
Yes. This, to me as well, with 7 questions in this game, going through it, this to me felt like this is the make or break moment probably in the section for most people. You do this game well, you bank a little bit of time by getting through it, you get your 7 points, you are really set up to be powerful for the second half. But if you miss some stuff in this game, like what we've just talked about, if you don't see these opportunities, another chance where the section can really fall apart on you. That's what this felt like to me. Is I was like, this is where the paths diverged for students.
I also think that when you look at scalings on this test and it's -10, this game helps contribute to that. What LSAC is saying is, we expect you to do reasonably well in this game.
Yeah.
You should not struggle in either time or getting questions right. They're thinking someone's going to go out and hit like 6 or 7 right on this, and they're going to do it within, the 8.5, 8:45-minute time frame. Whereas when we get to September and we look back on that test, every time it felt like you're pushing 8, 9, 10 minutes in these games.
Yeah.
You always were on the back heel. Whereas with this, you can pressure the test more, and they think that you should be able to do that. That's their expectation. This to me is a classic kind of game, like you said, make or break. Go back and look at this and figure out, if you didn't do well on it, what did you do wrong? What did you miss? What did you not realize that you should be actually focusing on? Did you understand it was grouping and linear? Because you should have. This, again, I'm getting into that kind of like drill sergeant mode where I'm like, you cannot afford to make mistakes here.
Yeah.
This is critical to how you perform. And that's because sitting at the end of this section is, in my opinion, a much harder game that is going to punish you and going to suck up time. So you have to build time right here. This is how the people who make this test perceive your performance. They expect you to do well.
Yeah.
And we do too.
I don't think you're being overly harsh. I wouldn't call that too drill sergeant. I mean, if anything, you're echoing the expectations of the people who make the test itself.
I'm being blunt about it.
Being blunt, but that's okay.
I'm like, if I was tutoring somebody and we went and did this game, I would say, if they didn't do well on it, I'd be like, okay, let's talk about this because we can learn from this game.
Yeah.
It may not be the highest level difficulty game, but remember the expectation on the LSAT is if something is lower or middle level difficulty and you want to get a good score, you are expected to nail those questions.
You got to crush it. Yeah. This was a crushable game, one you needed to really perform well on. I could feel going through it. I was like, I bet this is where a lot of people's section unraveled.
But even so, you start off with a list question. It's a classic list question, testing different rules. You kind of go through things and you're able to kind of like knock these off. You get a nice order out of it. You should be able to do a question like number 6 and feel comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. 7 is a global question about what could be true. And all of a sudden, a lot of the questions, like the first 2 are knocked off by the big sequence between onion, garlic, kale, and tomato. That's not difficult. You kind of go through the rest of it. It's easy enough to knock those off. So you've now done 2 out of the 7 questions. And here you are moving on to the second page. And they're giving you another local question. And you can see like questions 8 and 10 both deal with the yams. So, all right, we know that's going to knock out the jalapeno. That gives us a really straightforward sequence. You should be able to do those 2. That's 4 out of 7 that are not too challenging. And then you have some global questions like 9 and 11 before you get to that rule substitution. But again, like 9 is about the sequence.
Right.
I don't think that it's something that's going to like blow you away. 11's about sequencing as well. You can either try some solutions, give it a look, if you can see that the relationships are. If you have the 2 templates, neither of those questions is tough. And that gives you time to do question 12, which is going to take more time because it's a harder question. Yeah. It's a rule substitution question.
Yeah, you mentioned the second page, and of course that's true on paper. It's a little trickier to do what I'm about to suggest in a digital environment, but I still will suggest it. So I made the broad comment earlier about like read the entire game before you start to put pencil to paper, because you may learn some things that change how you're going to approach it. To that, I'll add a second lesson, which is don't be afraid to jump around through the questions a little bit, especially if maybe you don't feel like you've got the greatest grasp on the game, which I'm sure for a lot of people was the case here. I skipped question 7 and went and did 8, and then did 10, and then went back. So I was pretty gymnastic, pretty nimble as I moved through this. I hopped around a little bit, but I did it with purpose. I did it with intent because I wanted to make sure that I was in control. And I think for a lot of people, they feel very predetermined into how they have to do it. Well, question 8's next, so I'm due 8. Don't be afraid to move around. You probably do less of that than I do. I'm very agile, as it were, as I move through these questions. I don't feel terribly agile today, but that's Charleston's fault. When I was going through this game, I definitely was like, I don't want to do that one yet.
I'm, as you well know, I am all for controlling your environment as much as possible, either by doing games out of order or questions out of order. I don't do it a whole lot until I run into questions, usually like number 11, where it's like, okay, who can be here?
Right.
And it's a really kind of open global question. Oftentimes, if that question shows up early in a game, I'll come back to it later after I have more hypotheticals built up. So I know more about it.
The work you're going to inevitably do elsewhere is probably going to help you. Go do the work.
Yeah. In this case, question 11's late in that game. And at that point, I was very comfortable with what I was doing.
Me too. By 11, I felt
games. Great. Yeah. Templating games are built for questions like number 11 because you could see the possibilities so much more easily. So I didn't need to skip that. In general, I don't do a lot of question skipping until I'm like, oh, I can do this work on other questions and come back to this.
A very good point.
That's something we've talked about many times before. It's in our books and courses,
Sure.
So I'm not going to belabor the point here.
Anything else in this game that strikes you as a good topic for discussion?
Get the templates, crush the game.
Yeah.
That's the lesson.
There it is. All right. A very opportunistic game to me. Do well there and you're really positioned to succeed here. What about game 3?
Game 3, the computer technicians game.
That's right.
So this is a grouping game. And I love games like this where they're like, here you go, 2, 2, and 2. Nicely defined. Everything's fixed in place. The less stuff moving around in terms of logic games, the happier I am.
You mean numerically, right? Like
the groups.
Right.
The groups are fixed at 2, 2, and 2.
Right.
Now, the thing that they then did, which I was less pleased about, was they gave you 5 technicians to fill these 6 spaces. So, when we were talking about the September test, one of the mantras that you repeated was watch the numbers. Now, that's a mantra that should be repeated for every logic game section. Always keep your eye on the numbers. The very first game here was 5 into 7, and how we handled those 2 empty spaces was critical to success there. Here, you've got 5 into 6. So you've got a numerical distribution that pops up where one of these 5 technicians will be doubled.
Yes.
Now, I already talked a little bit about the dichotomy of that split, the bifurcation of questions and rules. It happens again to me. In this game, they split the rules up into kind of like 2 distinctive groups. And once again, you are well served by reading all the rules first before just jumping in and doing the game. Because the first 2 rules are kind of like, okay, if somebody does this with F, then that's going to affect X. So I'm like, these are really specific variable rules. I don't want to see a game with 4 of those rules because I'm going to have to constantly be remembering who's related to who.
Yeah. It's interesting you use the word specific, because I tend to think of them as more non-absolute, but I think we're saying the same thing. Specific in that they're very narrow rules, this variable, this, but at the same time, they're also wide open hypotheticals.
Yeah. This can happen at almost any point in the game. It's not overly controlling. It's just if. It's this localized rule that says if Smith examines F, then X is going to examine G. To me, narrow would probably be the better word here.
We're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, it's the same type of idea. But then look at the last 2 rules on this. It completely changes form. Now, you can't have an SW block, and you must have at least an RT block. And you're not going to get 2 RT blocks. So there really is only 1 RT block here. But they're saying that a computer is examined by R and T, and then you cannot have S and W. And the thing I really like about that is no overlap. Everything's great because you just addressed 4 of the 5 variables. The remaining variable is X, who, by the way, figures prominently in the first 2 rules. Right. And so my immediate thought is, I've got interplay here that is going to be fruitful.
Yeah, I actually made 2 comments back in September when we were first doing these like post-mortem game analyses. The first about numbers and balance and how balance is beautiful. I sound like Thanos.
Don't snap your fingers, man.
Don't worry. But you can balance the first game in this section. Just add 2 E's and you've got 7 to 7. This one's a little tougher to balance, but you know you've got a duplication. The second thing you have here, and I made this comment before, I'll say it again, back in September I made it before, is watch for small groups. There's only 3 essentially assignment positions to put things into here. And as soon as I saw, look, I'm down to 3 options tops for this block, especially in the last rule, those were very powerful observations or insights.
It's incredibly powerful because RT, that block, and you should, by the way, start with the last 2 rules when you're working with this game.
Same as the last game that we just discussed, yeah.
Exactly, and I find that really interesting because you can see that trending where it's like, and this is something they've done for years, so this isn't something new, but to see it basically back to back is kind of like a good reinforcement. You get that RT block, it only has 3 positions. It's either going to be an F or G or H. Now, let's just say for a moment that you put it in F. You now have 4 spaces that are open on G and H, but things are not completely open because you have S and W. They can't be a block.
Right.
That means one of S is on G, S and W is on G, and the remainder, at least to start off with, is on H.
Yeah.
So you've got to take a space in each one of those groups and reserve it for S and W, and then X is going to float above it. That gives you still an open variable. Somebody's getting doubled still, but you can see how limiting that is. And that's the most open of what turns into 3 templates, because you can then throw R and T onto G, and now you've got S and W floating around between F and H, and guess what? Your first 2 rules start coming into play. That's going to force W into F. It's going to force S into H. It's going to force X over into H as well. And then you have your last template, and R and T goes into H, and again, you've got S and W being affected by those first 2 rules. And so you have 3 really, really solid templates, 2 of which really fill in largely, and it's just a matter of like an open space, and one of them which is a little bit more open.
It's interesting. I did templates for this game. I didn't do them for game 2, despite I think them being powerful in game 2. I just was comfortable with my setup in 2 and kind of banged my way through it. But here it was so clear to me, look, there's only 3 options at the jump, basically. And they each have consequences. Let's just do them. But again, I mean, this is the beauty of templates. You never have to do them. But when they're available and you catch it, especially in a tough game, whew, man, they are, if you'll permit the phrase, they are a game changer.
I think this is a game where you don't have to do them.
Yeah.
However, it's super helpful to do them.
Yeah, I liked them here.
I like what you said, though, about like, you know, you can still do the game if you don't do them, but in a lot of template games, it's so helpful.
Yeah.
It makes everything that much faster and easier. And again, follow the numbers. That RT block has 3 spaces that it can go in. All right? Maybe you should just check that out. Even if you get halfway down the road and you're like, that's not hugely useful, I'll bet you $5 you learn something.
Yeah.
And then when you learn something, you just get more and more knowledgeable and more powerful in terms of attacking the game. So to me, once you have those templates, it's like, okay, now I'm just going through this. And again, we still have a list question that starts off with number 13 that you can get no matter what approach you take to this game. You still have questions like number 14 and number 16 where you have local questions where you can start making templates or hypotheticals as needed if you haven't already created those. And then the last question, maybe the other one that's unusual in this test, a little justify question.
Yeah.
what's going to force this? If you have the templates, that question becomes a lot easier because you can tell, for example, that R and T, by placing them in one of the groups, it doesn't determine everybody.
Right.
So A and B is wrong immediately. You can also figure that knowing where X isn't key either, and that eliminates C and E. Again, pairs of answers. A and B are very similar to me. C and E, similar. And then you get to that question, it's like, well, what's the one that actually looks different?
Yeah.
D. You can kind of abstractly reason those out when you examine them. And if what I just said was like, what did he just say? Which is not unreasonable. Go back and look at it. A and B both take R and T and put them in two different positions. We know that's not enough information. C and E focus on X. X isn't enough by itself. You need to have that doubled variable accounted for. Only D can do that for you.
I imagine there's a lot of people rewinding right now, and that's okay. Listen to this a couple times. For anyone out there wondering, and I think this is just, again, I'm trying to keep this to broader lessons despite individual games. If you're wondering how to determine templates, we've talked about this before. In fact, I think we did a discussion in an episode, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
There's blogs and stuff. You can Google, Power Square blog, talk about templates. There is a system. There's almost an algorithm to help you know at least that templates might be rewarding to you, and also how to avoid them in the wrong circumstances. So I strongly encourage you, if you're not familiar or comfortable with it, to do some research. Templates are crazy powerful when they're there. You need to be able to recognize that opportunity.
Well, think about it this way. Almost every single LSAT, certainly ones I can think of off the top of my head, has a game where either showing the templates or even showing all the possibilities specifically is the best and optimal and most time-efficient approach. So it's not like, I wonder if there's going to be a game on my test where I should use templates. It's more like, I wonder which game or which games on my test are going to have that.
Yeah. The way you described game 2 and the templates you created now make me feel like I missed an opportunity, frankly.
These things, and again, I think sometimes you and I have a tendency to want to say, well, I can just do it.
Right.
And so you might want to cut corners on that. There's certainly part of that in game 3 here where I'm like, geez, I think this game is actually really easy to control without templates as well. But templates to me is still the better approach. But
that's fair. Yeah.
My biggest complaint about this game, only 5 questions again.
I know.
I was like, dude, come on, give me more questions on games that I feel like I've just completely dominated. Any further comment on game 3?
Only that if game 2 didn't go your way, this was at least an opportunity to maybe get back into it. I think this game was easier than game 2. There's fewer questions, certainly, which is an objective truth. So I think even if you were feeling a little bit behind on time or just maybe a little uncomfortable, this might have been a chance to right the ship, as it were.
I think it's a good point.
Yeah.
Nothing devastatingly hard in the first 3 games. Opportunities to make mistakes. But this is always the case. There's no logic game section that doesn't have opportunities for error. Missed points, misreadings, those types of things. It's hard to protect against that, but the expectation from the people who made this exam was that you should be able to go through the first 3 games and have done reasonably well. And usually, I've said this before, that if you feel like something is going really well, like, I'm killing this, watch out.
Yeah.
Because there's something harder around the corner. There's a monster lurking.
It's a good feeling, but it's often predictive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I feel good, but now I'm worried, is really what it comes down to. It's almost like life is waiting to smack me in the face.
That's right.
And in this case, I think that Life and Logic Games has smacked everybody in the face with this final game. This is what we call the factory site visits.
Right.
And I have a lot of thoughts about this. I don't know if you want to open up this discussion or if you want me to.
Well, what I'm certain of here is that for a lot of people, even creating a diagram presented quite a challenge. And there was a lot of numerical mismatch here until you figure out exactly what's going on. And then it actually balances out a bit.
I think the big problem here is there's a lot of information.
Yeah.
And it's not working.
Good way to put it.
Cohesively. As cohesive as I felt the third game was, and to an extent the second game, I don't feel like this game had any cohesion at all. For me, you go back and you look at that September test, and everybody was like, flowers game. And you and I talked about it afterwards, and you totally mocked the flowers game, and I partially was like, it's not as hard as people say. I don't think the flowers game is as hard as this game. I think this game's harder.
Interesting.
I felt that this game was harder than anything on the September test, even though I would say the September test overall is harder, which, by the way, could be made into an excellent logical reasoning question.
I was about to say, someone diagrammed that.
This game, like in the flowers game, when I looked at that test, I said to myself, this is all working really well together. They've given you 50% of the spaces filled in. It's now about the remaining 2 spaces. There's limitations. I can mix and match, and it actually doesn't have that many solutions compared to what I thought when I started. When I got into this, it felt like, oh man, they're making me track all these disparate elements that don't connect well together. When that happens, you have to realize there is always going to be elements you can focus on that are limited. It's never just totally open-ended. They cannot do that. It is impossible to have a game with like millions of solutions in it because it's really tough to ask questions about that. So there has to be points that you can focus on and emphasize. But overall, I would much rather do 4 flower games than 4 of this type of game, even though they are very similar in how they are constructed in terms of like being advanced linear, different variable sets, and so forth. Like these 2 games are related to me, the flower game and this game. However, the nature of the rules in the flower game, I feel, is much friendlier than the nature of the rules in this game. I don't know how you feel about that.
I'd have to revisit the flower. Honestly, I haven't even looked at it since we did the recording for that test, the flower game. Just because when I looked at it, I was like, meh, okay. I don't know what's all the fuss
right
about.
Away.
Yeah, no, it does. That's why I agree with what you just said, is because I haven't revisited it. It can't be that interesting or that hard.
Yeah, I think you were overly...
And I might have gone a little hyperbolic about... But it's because I really want to emphasize the point to people that most of the difficulty that does get assigned to these games tends to be like a low-key hysteria of like, it's not that bad, you just need the right approach. And to me, the flowers game really opened itself up to the right approach. This one felt a little more brute force in a way.
I'd say so.
Yeah.
The hysteria over the flowers game wasn't just because of the flowers game. It was because of the rest of the games.
The section as a whole, I get it. And that I actually didn't disagree with. I think that was a very hard section in total.
100% agreement there.
Yeah.
There's no doubt to me that that's one of the harder logic game sections, and certainly would be in the argument for among the hardest of all time.
But I wouldn't put any individual game from it among the hardest of all time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the section as a whole is uncomfortable and pressurizing in terms of time.
Yeah.
This section struck me as a very normal logic game section where they're like, okay, there's a couple of games where you build time and then you're going to have to expend it on this last one. And so let's take a look at what they've given us here and I think why it would be a challenge.
Yeah.
First, as I said, the rules are all over the place. You start off with a bunch of open spaces. You've got these 3 countries, these 4 months. You've got these four representatives. Yeah. But then the damn representatives only go 3 times. And it's like, that's aggravating. So you have to just track all these little pieces. And I feel like there's just a lot of information. That was my first sign. I was like, and I'd heard about this game. So obviously when I come to it, I'm excited and I'm like, well, how hard is it going to be? When I read it, I was like, I don't like this. It seems like a lot of work. And as we all know, I'm lazy. I don't want to do a lot of work. So when I get to logic games that require a lot of work, I'm irritated with the people who've made the test because I feel like it's not a method or a trick or a backdoor that allows me to solve it. It's, as you said, brute force.
Yeah. It was the second half of the scenario here where things, at least for me, crystallized a bit. This is where things took on a slightly more like tangible form. Because you've got these 4 people who each go 3 times, and I was like, all right, I got to figure out where I'm going to put these 12 things. And then I could see how the months and the 3 site visits were going to play out. 4 months, 3 sites, I was like, there's your 12.
Yeah.
And that, as soon as I saw that, I was like, all right, I at least know how the structure, the architecture of this is going to operate. And then just to double check myself, I glanced at the first question and was like, I'm right.
So you use the 4 months.
Yes,
1, 2,
I used
3,
1 through 4
as
a base. And then I saw in each of those months that there were going to be 3 things happening. And that was where the 12 people were going to fill in.
So you've got a row then for India, Ghana, and France,
Precisely.
And then you're filling the people
And like
in.
I said, that was my instinct. I glanced at the first question and saw that my instincts, in this particular case, certainly not always, were spot on. And I felt good.
You talking about Charleston visits?
Yeah. I'll leave it at that.
You and your bad judgment. We love it.
Some late nights.
There should be, man.
I know.
That's why you go back to places that you used to live.
I know.
Have fun times.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. That's exactly how I set it up. I felt very confident in that because the 1, 2, 3, 4 is such a powerful linear draw. I think there's a choice that you can make where you can put the agents up there. I didn't feel like that was nearly as clear or easy to understand. I felt that it was much better to put the locations, the
France,
sites
Ghana,
above
India.
it. Yeah.
I was on the fence about that a little bit. And then again, I looked at the first question and was like, match the test. Do what they do.
If you're ever uncertain, that is a fantastic strategy to use. We've talked about that before, where what you should do is, glance at a question and be like, well, how did they do it? If I can match that, it'll be easier to answer the questions. And at least it gives you something to fall back on where, that's one solid way of looking at it.
I've mentioned it before, but for those who've forgotten or maybe missed it, the computer virus game from September 2016, the first 2 questions in that game saved me. They saved me. Or at least it felt at the time like they did. Maybe I'd have still put it together, but I was really kind of spiraling there for a second.
Sometimes fear is such a paralyzing factor because you're like, what am I supposed to do? And I'm supposed to be better at this than I'm, performing. And then you're like, okay, they did it. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, exactly.
And it just clicks in.
Precisely what it was. It was like, remind yourself of momentum sometimes. Just keep pushing forward.
Yeah, my experience was different with this. I felt extremely comfortable with the choices I'd made in terms of setting it up. I was like, this is the right way to do it. Like, it locked in. But I still felt uneasy because it was like, there is just so much happening. All these rules are just flying around. And so you have to start isolating sections. The problem with a game like this is it's got so many variables, so many open positions, so many rules that it feels overwhelming. You're like, what do I do? Where do I start? And so for me, I was like, I need to start looking at individual sections. And I started with the Ghana row, was actually the very first thing that I got into, because I was like, I have a pretty good sense of like what's filling this in. We know that V is going to visit Ghana, and it's going to be somewhere in the middle because V does India, then Ghana, and India in a sequence.
Right.
And that gives me some kind of movement. So I was like, well, V's got to be second or third. It can't be 1 or 4. So I was able to like at least isolate that and with Ghana and say, all right, V is right in there. And then the other thing that is that from the third rule that Y must visit Ghana in a month immediately preceding Watts. So I was like, we've got a YW block. Mm-hmm. All right, well, conceivably then, if YW is first and second, that's going to put V third. Mm-hmm. And if V is second, then YW is going to actually go third and fourth. And I was like, all right, so there's now 2 basic templates for what happens with Ghana. That made me feel a little bit better. It also allowed me to see that because of where V was actually going to be, that was going to affect India. Mm-hmm. And that India now had some limited solutions in terms of where where V could actually go in
Which
there.
Is based
and
on
so
the
I
first
started
rule.
playing around with that.
Off the first rule. No, it's funny. I approached it the exact same way. As soon as I saw 3 rules in a row that all had Ghana involved, I was like, there's my point of ingress. That's where I begin.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to do because that allows you to then fool around with India. And then you also have the India-France interaction. And that India-France interaction, I would imagine that a lot of people looked at it and said, okay, good, they can't share representatives. Yeah. No, it's much more powerful than that.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you have V showing up in India, you know that V can't show up in France. And it also means that you have to be really careful because you're going to have you've got to have like 2 representatives to visit a place like France. You can't isolate it where there's just one because then you won't have enough representative visits to fill all 4 spaces.
Right, that's exactly right. But yeah, I mean, anytime you look at a game that has 12 empty spots to start with, it's uphill. Like this is going to be a challenge. There's just so much opportunity for uncertainty. It reminds me a little bit, I don't know why this is usually the game that pops into my head, but the dogs in the dog show where 4 of the 6 get ribbons. But there's also greyhounds and labs, there's males and females. There's so much openness in that game. I think it has 18 open spaces.
It's interesting that it does, actually. It's interesting you mentioned that game because that was the game I was thinking about,
really?
Too. Yeah, same exact game where I'm like, man, things are all over the place. And then as you start breaking that game down, and I think that game's October of 1991.
It's ancient, yeah.
Yeah, it's that is the test that it is October of 1991. So like PT number 2. It's a test that I sometimes cite to people where they're like, oh, those old tests have no value. I'm like, go do the game section from that exam.
Yeah.
Call me afterwards. I will console you. Because it ends with 2 games that can be exceedingly rough. The third game is Hannah, which is this bizarre numerical distribution game that for many people, they don't get it at all and just feels like it's from another planet. And then the fourth game is the game we call the Dogs, which is 4 out of 6 dogs winning ribbons.
Yeah.
Super challenging.
We sell that game on our digital site too if anybody wants to pick it up.
Yeah, that is the ancestor.
Shameless plug.
That's the ancestor to this game. Like the first example of like wacky craziness happening all over the place, rules that don't seem to fit together. But then as you start to work with it, you begin to realize that there are limitations. And as you said, start with Ghana, then focus on India, then watch the India-France interplay. And I want to go back to that. You have to be really careful. You can't have 3 different representatives visit a place like India because that would mean only 1 representative is available for France. They can't fill enough spaces. They can only do 3 visits and there are 4. And the reverse is true. You can't have 3 different representatives visit France because then only 1 would remain for India, right. And that doesn't work.
Yeah, 1 can't fill all 4 months. And you know that V's done by the first rule. You see V's 3 visits right away in Rule 1, so you only have 3 people left.
That's exactly right. And you have some good limitations on where V can actually be. The last point, I think, is the rule that is the second to last one, that Y cannot visit any site in the 4th month. And I think that's, most people are just like, okay, no Y. But it actually is much different than that because you start with that, but what does that mean for that 4th month? It means you only have 3 people available, all right, V, W, and Z. But really critically, they are going to have to each appear once. You can't have duplication because you can't have somebody in 2 places at one time.
Yeah. And so V can only do it in 1 place. So,
yeah.
Right.
All of a sudden, you're like, well, guess what's going on in India in that 4th position? Something that they don't really test in a direct way, but you're able to figure that out. And then you've got W and Z that are now flipping around on Ghana and France in that 4th position, and that becomes limited. Keep this in mind. If you've got 3 spaces to fill and you've got 4 candidates, as soon as they remove one of those candidates, each of those other 3 are being used a single time. That's super limiting. Go look at that 4th month and figure out what can happen because that is one of the keys to the game. And people who are good at logic games figured it out.
Yeah.
And that made a big difference because all of a sudden the calmness seeps in as you start placing variables and realizing, hey, there's a limitation here.
There's this interesting dichotomy, as even I just kind of listened to us talk about this juxtaposition where there are a lot of insights. Think of all the things we've just said, the truths about this game. But that's almost counterbalanced by itself in that there are so many things to consider.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
Notice how it was systematic, though. We figured out that Ghana, both of us independently, not talking about it beforehand, was the good place to start. That then bled into India. The rule about India and France then allowed us further insights. And then we came back to the individual month rule and looked at that at the end and said, well, that gives me another insight. Is it big? Is it unwieldy? Totally. I don't like this game because of all that information. I like it clean and tight. That's not what's going on here. But I now have a lot of information and it's way more limited than it looks. I didn't make templates. I actually made miniature templates for some of the rows like Ghana and India, but I didn't make templates for the entire game. And that was critical because by the time I got into the questions, I was like, I feel better about this.
Yeah.
Still hate the game, but feel better about it.
Oh, you don't hate it. It's not my favorite. It's not a lot of fun. A game like 3 to me is fun. It's like I know exactly how to bang my way through this.
2 and 3, to me, I really enjoyed his games, felt great about them. games like this, I'm just never going to enjoy just because it's too much work.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean there aren't easy questions. Like question 18, you can work your way through it. It's just a list question. 19 and 21, I think, are very straightforward questions. That's 3 out of the 6 questions right there that I don't think are beyond anybody's capacity, even if they didn't understand any of this.
Yeah, this is a bit exhausting. This is a lazy man's nightmare. And I think both of us try to be as lazy as possible when we take this test.
Truly. I want to save all the energy mentally that I can for when I really have to use it. And then I hate using it. This was one of the situations where I had to use it.
Same.
But, I mean, look at question 19. If V is in the second month. Okay. If V is in the second month, we know from that first rule that there's this kind of sequence. That means V's got to be India in the second month, Ghana in the third, and then India in the fourth month. Look at answer choice A. V visits Ghana in the third month. That's easy. You can do that even if you had a hard time understanding what the heck was going on in this game. It's straight from the very first rule.
Yeah, how did you feel about the questions in general? I mean, obviously I know a lot of people just were baffled by the setup itself, hopefully less so having listened to us, but the questions didn't feel that bad. I didn't feel like there was a whole lot of trickery going on in the questions themselves.
No, I think there's a really good spread of this. Like you have a list question, then you have 19 is this local question, then you have kind of like a globally abstract type of question.
Mm-hmm.
Notice how A and B, by the way, are the same answer to me. This is the point we talked about earlier. You can't have 3 reps visit France. You can't have 3 visit India because of the France-India relationship
Last rule,
here.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's a big abstract kind of thing, but then we're back to local, then another global. I didn't feel like this, I felt like this was a normal set of questions. The question set wasn't deeply challenging and it didn't require a massive amount of work to get through. So maybe the last 2 questions would be the hardest. I can see people struggling with 20 as well, but that's not too bad to have 3 questions on a game like this where you're going to have to spend most of the time and the other 3 be, I'm just going to be honest about it, not hard.
Mm-hmm.
18, 19, and 21 are not difficult questions. You should be able to do those even if your setup was like, I don't know what I'm doing. You just scribbled a bunch of random lines.
Gibberish.
Yeah, 20, 22, and 23 require like higher level analysis of the game. So there we go.
Yeah.
I think we've both venerated and dismissed this game.
That's a fair way to put
Same
it.
sentence. Hard game, in my opinion. Harder than the Flowers game from September, which may surprise some people. Partially because I don't like the game, but I don't think that this section as a whole is overly challenging, and they have done people a favor by keeping this game at the end and allowing them to build extra time in the first 3.
Hopefully, yeah. And I know you're right that this was not overly challenging because minus 10.
Yeah.
So there you go.
And so the logical reasoning and the reading comprehension, which I think I've spent more time on than you have just because of your various travels and so forth.
Shenanigans.
Yeah.
Yeah, you definitely have spent more time on this than I have, but I think reading comp was probably the defining part of this test in terms of just difficulty or standout challenge.
I think the LR, like I said, I've probably explained 10 of the questions at this point on our LSAT discussion forum, and really random, not like questions 1 through 10, but like I did the Stickleback question and the entropy question, the one about the university percentages. To me, it's surprisingly similar that they created traps for people where it's like, did you misread that? Like that university dormitory question. Yeah. I love what they did with that, because if you just say, oh, it's one dormitory than the other, you're missing the question. If you realize it's the entirety of the university and then a single dormitory, then you can get that question right relatively, I'm not going to say easy, I still think it's a hard question, but more easily than you could otherwise. But that's about reading close. Go look at the first game and the last rule. That's about reading closely and expecting at all turns that the people who make this test are trying to trick you, because that is a fact. They call it testing your reading ability and how closely you're reading. I call it they're trying to trick you.
Yeah.
So be suspicious. It doesn't matter whether it's logic games, logical reasoning, reading comprehension. Be suspicious. Be wary. Be on your guard.
Yeah. Incredulous, as it were.
It's kind of like when my daughter comes in and she's like, this thing happened. I'm like, did it
Is that really?
Or are you just trying to get something? That's kind of what I get from the LSAT. Hey, check out this stat. Is that stat really real, or are you manipulating things here? So
it's a very fair point, but and a very fair section. I liked these games on the whole.
So did I. I could do without that last game, as I've said, but it's still doable. And as an exercise in studying logic games, this is a good test.
Real good test.
I think this is a worthwhile section to study. And if you struggled with it, learn from it. I wrote a blog called The Benefits of Failure. And it sounds really weird, like, what's the value in failing? The value in failing is you learn what you need to get better at, what you can improve upon, and that makes you better the next time out. So if you didn't do well on this section, or if you took it as a practice test and you struggled, go learn from it. You will see these types of ideas again for sure.
Yep.
Anything else?
No, I think that's probably the place to end it.
I agree with you 100%. So we hope you enjoyed it. We certainly enjoyed talking about this test, and I think doing it as well. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or any other place you find it. Give us a rating as well. And if you have questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We are always happy to help. So on behalf of John and myself, have a great week, and we will talk to you soon.
And Happy New Year.
Thank you. That's right. Happy New Year.